The lantern was still burning when they found it at dawn, sitting beside the iron gate like someone had just set it down moments before. But Dinah Foster had been missing for hours, and the flame that should have long since guttered out continued to flicker with an impossible persistence. The garden path showed no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, nothing but that single point of light burning in the morning mist. The overseer would search for 3 days, but Dinah had simply vanished as if she had walked straight into the darkness and been swallowed whole. What they didn't know was that every spring when the moon hung full and heavy over Savannah, that same lantern light would return to dance along the garden path, waiting for something or someone that never came. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Hartwell plantation sat on the eastern edge of Savannah like a jewel in a crown of moss and magnolia, its white columns rising from the Georgia earth with the kind of arrogance that only generations of wealth could buy. In the spring of 1840, the house gleamed under fresh paint, its gardens manicured to perfection by hands that would never be credited for their work. Behind the main house, past the carefully cultivated roses and the fountain imported from Italy, stood a row of cabins where the enslaved lived in conditions that contradicted everything the plantation's beauty pretended to represent. Dinah Foster had lived in the third cabin from the end for the past 12 years. Ever since Cornelius Hartwell had purchased her at auction in Charleston to work as a house servant for his wife, Victoria. Dinah had been 20 years old then, tall and graceful with eyes that seemed to hold more thoughts than she ever spoke aloud. She had learned quickly that survival meant keeping those thoughts locked away behind a mask of compliance, that the price of resistance was paid in blood and broken bones. She had watched other enslaved people try to fight, try to run, try to maintain some dignity in a system designed to strip it away. Most failed. Some died. A few made it north, though the stories of their success were always whispered rather than celebrated, afraid that even acknowledging freedom might somehow curse those left behind. Dinah had never tried to run. She had never given the Hartwells reason to doubt her obedience. She had simply endured day after day, year after year, until endurance itself became a kind of quiet rebellion. Victoria Hartwell was not the cruelest mistress Dinah might have served, but she was perhaps the most exhausting. She demanded perfection in every detail of her household, from the way the silver was polished to the exact temperature of her morning tea. She required Dinah to dress her each morning, a process that could take an hour or more as Victoria changed her mind about colors and fabrics with the whimsy of someone who had never faced a genuine consequence in her life. Victoria spoke to Dinah the way someone might speak to a particularly clever dog, praising her work when it pleased her and scolding her with the kind of casual cruelty that never recognized itself as cruelty at all. Dinah absorbed it all, her face a careful blank, her movements efficient and invisible. She had learned that being invisible was the closest thing to safety she could achieve. The other enslaved people on the Hartwell plantation knew Dinah as someone who kept to herself, who worked hard and never caused trouble. She was friendly enough at the evening gatherings when the work was done, when they would sit together outside the cabins and share what little food they could supplement their rations with. When they would sing songs that carried memories of a homeland most of them had never seen. But even then Dinah remained slightly apart, as if some part of her existed in a space no one else could reach. Old Marcus, who had been enslaved on the plantation longer than anyone could remember, sometimes watched Dinah with an expression that suggested he recognized something in her that others missed. He never spoke of it directly, but occasionally he would warn the younger ones to leave Dinah be when she walked alone at night, to not follow her when she slipped away to the gardens after the house had gone dark. It was true that Dinah walked at night, had been walking at night for as long as anyone could remember. after Victoria had finally dismissed her for the evening, after the last dish had been washed and the last candle extinguished in the main house, Dinah would return to her cabin just long enough to exchange her day clothes for a simple dress, and then she would take a lantern and walk the garden paths. The overseer, a man named Cyrus Webb, who took a particular pleasure in enforcing discipline, had questioned her about it once early on. Dinah had explained in her quietest voice that she was checking the herb garden for pests, that Victoria had given her permission to tend it. It was not entirely a lie. Victoria had indeed assigned her the herb garden, had praised her skill with growing the medicinal plants that the plantation relied on. What Dinah did not mention was that she spent most of her night walks simply moving through the darkness, the lantern swinging gently in her hand, walking the same circuit of paths over and over as if searching for something she could never quite name. The spring of 1840 had arrived with unusual warmth, bringing the flowers into bloom earlier than expected and filling the air with a sweetness that felt almost aggressive in its beauty. Dinah moved through her days as she always had, waking before dawn to build the fires in the main house, preparing Victoria's breakfast, helping her dress, attending to the 1,000 small tasks that filled the hours between sunrise and sunset. But something had shifted in her, a restlessness that she could not entirely suppress. She found herself making small mistakes, forgetting which dress Victoria had wanted to wear, setting the tea service on the wrong side of the table. Victoria noticed, of course, and her scoldings became sharper, her threats more pointed. She reminded Dinah that Cornelius had been considering selling some of the house servants, that there were younger girls who could be trained to take Dinah's place. The threat was not new, but something about the way Victoria said it that spring made it feel more real, more immediate. On the evening of April 17th, Dinah finished her work later than usual. Victoria had hosted a dinner party and the cleaning had stretched long into the night. By the time Dinah was finally dismissed, the moon had already risen, full and heavy in a cloudless sky. She walked back to her cabin with her shoulders aching and her hands raw from scrubbing. The other cabins were dark and quiet. Everyone else had long since gone to sleep, exhausted by their own labors. Dinah stood in her doorway for a long moment, looking out at the garden paths silvered by moonlight. She should have gone to bed. She should have taken what little rest she could before dawn arrived and the cycle began again. Instead, she lit her lantern, picked up her shawl, and walked out into the night. The garden was transformed by moonlight into something that felt separate from the daylight world, as if the darkness had erased the boundary between the plantation's careful cultivation and something wilder, older, more honest. Dinah walked her usual circuit, past the roses that Victoria prided herself on, past the fountain with its frozen stone cherubs, past the herb garden where she grew feverfew and chamomile and yarrow. The lantern light pushed back the darkness in a small, warm circle. But beyond that circle, the shadows were absolute. Dinah had never been afraid of these shadows. If anything, she felt more herself in the darkness than she ever did in daylight, when every moment was performed for the benefit of those who owned her body, if not her soul. She had completed 2 circuits of the garden when she noticed something unusual. Near the back gate, the one that led out to the road beyond the plantation, there was another light. It flickered like her lantern, but it seemed to come from nowhere, hovering in the air about waist height. Dinah stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She stood perfectly still, watching the light, waiting to see if it would move or vanish or reveal itself as some trick of her tired mind. The light remained steady, patient, waiting. Dinah took a step toward it, then another. The light seemed to brighten slightly, as if acknowledging her approach. As Dinah drew closer, she began to hear something beneath the usual night sounds of crickets and distant river water. It was music, but unlike any music she had heard before. It had no melody she could follow, no rhythm she could name, but it pulled at something deep inside her chest with an insistence that made her breath catch. The light pulsed gently in time with the music, if music was even the right word for the sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dinah knew she should turn back. She knew that anything unusual, anything unexplained was dangerous for someone in her position. Questions would be asked, suspicions would be raised. But her feet kept moving forward, drawn by something stronger than caution or common sense. When she reached the gate, the hovering light was even more clearly impossible. It burned without fuel, without a candle or oil or any source she could identify. It simply existed, a point of illumination that defied every practical understanding of how the world worked. Dinah set her own lantern down on the ground beside the gate, her hands trembling slightly. The moment the lantern touched earth, the hovering light brightened until it was almost painful to look at directly. Dinah raised her hand to shield her eyes, and in that gesture of shielding she felt something inside herself finally break open. All the years of careful control and forced compliance and swallowed rage suddenly flooding through her with a force that left her gasping. She thought of her mother, sold away when Dinah was 8 years old. She thought of the baby she had carried for 7 months before Victoria, angry about some imagined slight, had struck her hard enough to cause a miscarriage. She thought of every morning she had woken to another day of servitude, every night she had fallen into exhausted sleep only to wake and do it all again. She thought of all the words she had never spoken, all the anger she had never allowed herself to feel, all the grief she had packed down so deep that she had almost forgotten it was there. The light pulsed brighter still, and Dinah understood without knowing how she understood that it was responding to something in her, that it was offering something she could not quite name but desperately needed. She reached out her hand toward the light. Her fingers passed through it, and she felt a sensation like cool water running over her skin, except the water seemed to flow inward rather than across the surface. The music, if it was music, grew louder, filling her head until there was no room for anything else. Dinah took another step forward and then another, and with each step she felt herself becoming less solid, less defined, as if the boundaries that held her together were dissolving like sugar in water. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a kind of peace she had not known since childhood, before she understood what she was, before she learned that her life was not her own. The last thing Dinah saw before the light consumed her entirely was her lantern sitting beside the gate, its flame still burning steady and true. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, this small, practical detail remaining constant while everything else fell away. Then even that was gone, and there was only light and music and a sensation of moving very fast through a space that had no direction she could measure. She was not falling and she was not flying. She was simply going, traveling towards something that she had been unconsciously seeking every night she walked these garden paths, every moment she had spent enduring the unendurable. Where she was going, she could not have said. She only knew that she was finally, impossibly, moving toward it. Dawn came to the Hartwell plantation as it always did, with birdsong and slowly gathering light. Victoria Hartwell woke at her usual hour and rang the bell for Dinah to come help her dress. When Dinah did not appear after 5 minutes, Victoria rang again, more insistently. When another 5 minutes passed with no response, Victoria rose from her bed in her nightgown, something she never did, and marched through the house calling for her servant. The other house slaves emerged from the kitchen and the laundry room, confused by the commotion. No one had seen Dinah that morning. She had not come to build the fires. She had not put the kettle on for tea. She had simply not appeared, and for Victoria Hartwell, who had built her entire existence on the assumption that her orders would be followed, this absence was almost incomprehensible. Cornelius Hartwell was summoned from his study, and he in turn summoned Cyrus Webb, the overseer. Webb walked down to the slave cabins with the grim efficiency of a man who had dealt with runaways before. He pounded on the door of Dinah's cabin, and when no answer came, he pushed it open. The cabin was empty. Dinah's bed was made. Her few possessions, her spare dress and her tin cup and the small wooden box where she kept needles for mending, were all in their usual places. Nothing suggested a hasty departure. Webb questioned the other enslaved people. No one had seen Dinah since the previous night. Marcus, the old man who had watched Dinah walk the gardens for years, said only that she had been going to check her herb garden as she often did. He said it with a complete lack of expression that Webb found suspicious but could not quite challenge. It was Marcus who led Webb to the back gate, though he claimed it was only because he wanted to check if anything in the herb garden might explain Dinah's absence. What they found there would become the subject of whispered speculation for years to come. Dinah's lantern sat on the ground beside the gate, its flame still burning despite the fact that it should have consumed all its oil hours before. Webb stared at it, his practical mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. He reached out to touch the lantern and found it cool to the touch, as if the flame produced no heat at all. He looked at Marcus with an accusation in his eyes that he could not quite voice. Marcus looked back at him with the blank expression enslaved people had perfected, revealing nothing. Webb organized a search party immediately. He had Cornelius Hartwell offer a reward of $50 for information leading to Dinah's recovery. He questioned every person on the plantation, slave and free alike, trying to piece together where she might have gone. The road beyond the back gate was examined for footprints, but the hard-packed earth revealed nothing. Dogs were brought in to try to track her scent, but they circled the area around the gate in confusion and refused to follow any trail. It was as if Dinah had simply ceased to exist the moment she set down her lantern. Webb searched for 3 days, expanding the search radius further each time, checking the river in case she had drowned, investigating the woods in case she had tried to hide there. He found nothing. Not a piece of torn fabric, not a footprint, not a single sign that Dinah Foster had ever walked beyond that gate. Victoria Hartwell was distraught, though her distress had less to do with concern for Dinah than with the massive inconvenience of having to train a new servant. She complained bitterly to Cornelius that Dinah had seemed so reliable, that she had never imagined she would be the kind to run off. She insisted that Dinah must have had help, that someone must have orchestrated her escape, though she could provide no evidence for this theory. Cornelius, more practical in his cruelty, simply wrote off the loss in his account books and purchased a younger girl from an auction in Charleston to take Dinah's place. Within a month, the household had adjusted to the new arrangement, and Dinah's name was spoken less and less frequently, until it seemed she had never existed at all. But the enslaved people on the plantation did not forget. They remembered how Dinah had walked the gardens at night with her lantern, how she had always seemed to be searching for something none of them could see. They remembered the impossible lantern still burning at dawn, and though Webb had eventually extinguished it with a kind of angry finality, they whispered that the flame had seemed reluctant to go out, as if it wanted to continue waiting for Dinah's return. Old Marcus told anyone who would listen that Dinah had found what she was looking for, though he would never elaborate on what that meant. Some of the others thought she had drowned in the river and her body had been carried away by the current. Some thought she had made it north, though no one could explain how she had managed it with no preparation and no help. A few, the ones who still remembered the old stories from Africa, thought something else entirely, but they kept those thoughts to themselves. The spring turned to summer and summer to fall, and the seasons cycled through their endless repetition. The plantation continued its operations with the brutal efficiency that made it profitable. people were born into slavery, grew up in slavery, died in slavery, their lives measured in the crops they produced and the comfort they provided to those who owned them. Victoria Hartwell eventually stopped mentioning Dinah entirely, and Cornelius never spoke of her at all. The garden paths where Dinah had walked grew slightly wild without her careful attention to the herb garden, until Victoria assigned the task to someone else and order was restored. It seemed that Dinah Foster would be forgotten entirely, just another name in the ledger of souls lost to the machinery of slavery. But the following spring, when the moon rose full over Savannah, something extraordinary happened. A young man named Isaac, recently purchased by Cornelius to work in the stables, was walking back to his cabin late one night when he saw a light near the back gate. At first, he assumed it was someone with a lantern checking on something in the garden. But as he watched, the light began to move in a slow circuit along the same paths Isaac had been told Dinah used to walk. The light moved with purpose, as if someone was carrying it, but Isaac could see no person, no hand holding the lantern, no shadow cast by any body. Just the light itself swinging gently as it traced the familiar route through the garden. Isaac stood frozen, watching the light complete its circuit. When it returned to the gate, it seemed to pause as if waiting. Isaac thought he heard something beneath the night sounds, a whisper or a song or something that was neither but somehow both. The hair on his arm stood up, and he felt a cold certainty settle over him that he was witnessing something that existed outside the normal rules of the world he knew. The light remained by the gate for perhaps 10 minutes, though Isaac would later have difficulty judging the actual passage of time. Then, as the moon began to dip toward the horizon, the light slowly faded, growing dimmer and dimmer until it winked out entirely, leaving only darkness and the smell of wisteria heavy on the air. Isaac told Marcus about what he had seen the next morning, speaking quietly while they worked in the tobacco field. Marcus listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. When Isaac finished, Marcus was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "That was Dinah," he said simply. "She walks her path one night every spring when the moon is full and high. She's still searching." Isaac wanted to ask what Dinah was searching for, why she would return to a place that had held her in bondage, but something in Marcus's expression told him the old man had said all he was going to say. They worked in silence for the rest of the day, but Isaac never forgot the sight of that impossible light moving through the darkness with such deliberate purpose. Over the years, others saw the light. It appeared reliably every spring on the night of the full moon, always following the same path through the garden, always pausing by the back gate as if waiting for something that never came. Some who saw it were frightened and hurried back to their cabins, pulling the doors shut and refusing to speak of it. Others watched with a kind of awed reverence, feeling that they were witnessing something sacred, a mystery that defied the brutal logic of their daily existence. A few claimed they could hear music when the light appeared, though they could never quite describe what the music sounded like or where it seemed to come from. The light never harmed anyone. It simply traced its path and faded with the descending moon year after year, a persistent echo of a woman who had walked into darkness and never returned. Victoria Hartwell saw the light once in 1846, 6 years after Dinah's disappearance. She had been unable to sleep and was standing at her bedroom window looking out over the gardens when she saw the glow begin its circuit. She watched it trace the paths with a growing sense of unease, her mind trying to find a rational explanation and failing. When the light paused by the gate, Victoria felt a sudden surge of recognition, though she could not have said what she recognized. For just a moment she thought she saw a figure in the light, tall and graceful, carrying a lantern. Then it was gone, and Victoria was left staring into ordinary darkness. She never spoke of it to anyone, but after that night she refused to look out her bedroom window after dark, and she had the herb garden removed entirely, replaced with a fountain that she hoped would erase all memory of the woman who had tended it. Cornelius Hartwell died in 1851, and Victoria followed him 2 years later. Their children inherited the plantation, and the inheritance came with all the usual complications of property and debt and disputed wills. The plantation changed hands twice more over the next decade, and with the approach of the Civil War, the entire structure of the world the Hartwells had built began to crack and crumble. In 1861, when Georgia seceded from the Union, many of the enslaved people on the plantation fled north as federal troops drew closer. By 1865, when the war finally ended, the plantation stood mostly empty, its fields overgrown, its great house damaged by passing soldiers and looters. The slave cabins were abandoned, their doors hanging open, their interiors exposed to weather and decay. But the light continued to appear every spring on the night of the full moon. Union soldiers camped on the property in 1864 reported seeing it and were convinced the plantation was haunted. Local people began to speak of the ghost of a slave woman who walked the garden path searching for the freedom she never found in life. The story evolved and changed with each telling. Some said Dinah had been murdered by the overseer and her spirit could not rest. Others claimed she had died trying to escape and her ghost returned to complete the journey. A few remembered Marcus's words and said she had found something in that final walk, something that took her beyond the boundaries of the physical world, and she returned each spring to remind the living that there were paths that slavery could not block, doors that no master could lock. The plantation eventually sold to a merchant from Savannah who had made his fortune in shipping. He had no patience for ghost stories and ordered the old slave cabins torn down, the gardens redesigned, the entire property renovated to erase the memory of what it had been. But the light continued to appear, undeterred by changes in ownership or landscape. The merchant's wife saw it and insisted they move back to town. Their children saw it and whispered about it to their friends. Servants hired to maintain the house reported the phenomenon with varying degrees of fear and fascination. The merchant finally gave up and sold the property at a loss, frustrated by his inability to rationalize away something that defied rational explanation. In the late 1800s, the property was purchased by a spiritualist society that believed the light was a genuine manifestation of the spirit world. They held seances in the garden, trying to communicate with what they believed was Dinah's ghost. They asked questions and waited for responses that never came. The light appeared on its appointed night regardless of their presence, traced its path with the same patient deliberation it had always shown, and faded as the moon descended. One of the spiritualists, a woman named Abigail Winters, who claimed to have genuine mediumistic abilities, said that she received an impression from the light, a feeling rather than words. She said the spirit was not trapped or suffering. She said it was waiting, though, for what she could not determine. She said there was a profound peace in the light and a profound sorrow, and they existed together in a way that should have been contradictory but somehow was not. The 20th century arrived, and with it came electric lights and automobiles and a world that had little patience for mysteries that could not be explained or exploited. The property changed hands again and again, subdivided and developed and redeveloped as Savannah expanded. The garden where Dinah had walked was eventually consumed by a residential neighborhood. The paths paved over for driveways and sidewalks, the gate long since torn down and carted away. But the light continued to appear, now manifesting on a suburban street, now moving through backyards and flower beds planted by people who had no idea what had once stood in that space. Residents would occasionally report a strange phenomenon, a light with no source that appeared one night each spring and moved in a pattern that seemed purposeful, but made no sense in the modern context. In 1973, a researcher named Dr. Helena Cross became interested in the phenomenon after reading historical accounts of the light in the Savannah Historical Society archives. She spent 2 years investigating, interviewing elderly residents whose grandparents had worked on the plantation, reviewing property records and slave manifests, trying to piece together the true story of Dinah Foster. What she discovered was fragmentary at best. Dinah had existed, that much was certain. The records showed her purchase in 1828 and noted her disappearance in 1840 with the terse notation, "Runaway, not recovered." But beyond these basic facts, Dinah's life remained a mystery. Dr. Cross could find no record of where she had been born, who her parents were, whether she had any children beyond the one Victoria Hartwell's diary mentioned losing. Dinah had been erased by a system that saw her only as property, and the light was the only testimony that remained to prove she had been more than an entry in an account book. Dr. Cross was present on the night of the full moon in April 1974, standing on what had been the garden path with a camera and recording equipment. She watched the light appear exactly as the historical accounts had described, a soft glow that seemed to have no source, moving with deliberate purpose along a route that no longer made sense in the changed landscape. She tried to measure it with her instruments, but the light registered on none of them. It appeared only to the human eye, a phenomenon that defied technological verification. She tried to follow it as it moved, but found that when she walked too close, the light would fade slightly, as if it needed space to manifest fully. So she kept her distance and simply observed, trying to understand what she was witnessing. What struck Dr. Cross most was the quality of the light itself. It was not harsh or cold like electric light, nor was it the warm flicker of candle flame. It had a quality she struggled to describe in her notes, writing and crossing out and writing again, trying to find words adequate to capture what she saw. Finally, she settled on patient. The light seemed patient, endlessly patient, as if it had all the time in the world to wait for whatever it was waiting for. When it reached the spot where the back gate had once stood, now the corner of someone's backyard, the light paused for exactly 12 minutes by Dr. Cross's watch. She thought she could hear something during those 12 minutes, a sound like wind through leaves or water over stones, or perhaps music played on instruments that no longer existed. Then as the moon touched the horizon, the light faded slowly away, and Dr. Cross was left standing in ordinary darkness with more questions than she had started with. Dr. Cross published her findings in a journal of parapsychology, and her article drew some interest from other researchers and paranormal investigators. Several attempts were made to capture the phenomenon on film or video with mixed results. Some showed only empty darkness. Others showed a vague luminescence that could have been anything from genuine phenomenon to camera malfunction. No footage ever captured the full experience of watching the light move through its circuit, the sense of purpose and presence that observers consistently reported. Dr. Cross concluded that the light was either a genuine manifestation of something beyond current scientific understanding, or it was a mass hallucination so consistent and persistent that it might as well be real. Either way, she argued, it deserved serious study rather than dismissal. But serious study was difficult when the phenomenon appeared only once a year for a brief period, when it could not be reproduced or controlled or subjected to the kind of rigorous testing that science demanded. The light remained stubbornly mysterious, revealing nothing more than it had revealed to the first people who saw it in 1841. It simply appeared, traced its path, and faded year after year, decade after decade, century after century. Some years, dozens of people would gather to watch it, drawn by news coverage or word of mouth. Other years, it would appear to only a single accidental observer, someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The light seemed indifferent to whether it was witnessed or not. It followed its path with the same patient deliberation regardless of who was watching. In the modern era, the phenomenon has become something of a local legend in Savannah, mentioned in ghost tour guides and paranormal investigation shows. But most of these treatments miss something essential about the light, reducing it to a simple ghost story or haunting, stripping away the deeper questions it poses. Because the light is not simply the spirit of a woman who died, it is the testament of a woman who vanished, who walked into mystery and left behind only this annual reminder that she had existed, that her life had meant something even if history failed to record it. The light is Dinah's answer to erasure, her refusal to be forgotten, her insistence on being witnessed even if she cannot be understood. On a spring night in 2024, a young woman named Jennifer Hayes was walking her dog late at night. Later than she normally would have been out, but she had been working long hours, and this was her only chance for exercise. She lived in one of the houses built on what had once been the Hartwell plantation, though she had no idea of the history beneath her feet. She was thinking about work deadlines and bills and the thousand mundane concerns that fill modern life when her dog suddenly stopped walking and began to whine, staring at something Jennifer could not see. She looked up and saw the light beginning its circuit through the neighborhood. Jennifer had heard rumors about the light, dismissed them as local superstition, the kind of stories people tell to make their ordinary lives feel more interesting. But here it was, undeniably real, moving through her neighbor's yard with that strange, purposeful quality that could not be mistaken for car headlights or street lamps or any other rational explanation. She stood perfectly still, hardly breathing, watching the light trace its path. Her dog pressed against her legs, trembling but not barking, as if he understood that what they were witnessing required silence. The light moved closer, and Jennifer felt a sudden, intense emotion that she could not immediately name. It was grief, she realized. She was feeling grief, profound and overwhelming, though she could not have said why or for whom. The light paused near where Jennifer stood, as if noticing her. For a moment, Jennifer thought she saw something in the light, the outline of a figure, tall and graceful, carrying something that might have been a lantern. The figure seemed to look at her, and Jennifer felt seen in a way that went beyond simple visual recognition. It was as if the light was acknowledging her, witnessing her in return, recognizing something in Jennifer that she barely recognized in herself. The moment passed, and the light continued on its path, moving toward the corner where a back gate had once stood nearly 200 years before. Jennifer followed it, her dog pulling back on the leash but unable to resist her forward momentum. When the light reached its destination, it paused as it always did, and Jennifer stood watching from a respectful distance. She could hear the music now, or something like music, rising and falling in patterns that felt both foreign and familiar. She thought about the woman who had walked this path, who had been enslaved and erased and forgotten by almost everyone. She thought about all the other people who had been treated as property, as things rather than human beings, whose lives had been stolen and whose stories had been lost. The light seemed to pulse gently, and Jennifer understood in that moment that the light was not just about Dinah Foster. It was about every person who had been denied their humanity, every story that had been erased, every life that had been deemed unworthy of remembering. Tears ran down Jennifer's face, though she did not entirely know why she was crying. The light remained steady for its 12 minutes, patient and constant, waiting for something that had not come in nearly 200 years and might never come. Then, as the moon touched the horizon, the light began to fade. Jennifer watched it grow dimmer and dimmer, watched it shrink down to a single point of brilliance, watched that point finally wink out, leaving her standing in darkness with her trembling dog and a feeling in her chest that felt like an enormous door had opened and closed in the space of a heartbeat. She walked home slowly, trying to process what she had witnessed. She spent the next week researching the history of her property, discovering the plantation that had stood there, reading Dr. Cross's article, finding the scattered historical references to Dinah Foster. She learned that Dinah had been 32 years old when she disappeared, that she had been described in one document as skilled in physic, which suggested knowledge of healing herbs, that she had been purchased for $300, which was a relatively high price indicating her value as a skilled worker. These were the only facts Jennifer could find, the bare skeleton of a life that had surely been rich with thoughts and feelings and experiences that would never be known. Jennifer began attending the annual appearance of the light, marking the date on her calendar, making sure she was present each spring when the moon rose full over Savannah. She was not alone. Others came as well. Some curious tourists, some serious researchers, some people like Jennifer who had been accidentally confronted with the phenomenon and found themselves unable to let it go. They would gather in loose groups, speaking in hushed voices, waiting for the light to appear. And it always did, punctual as clockwork, beginning its circuit exactly as the moon reached its zenith, moving through the changed landscape as if the garden still existed, as if the past was not past at all but merely overlaid with the present like two images on the same film. Over time, Jennifer began to understand something that Dr. Cross had hinted at, but never quite articulated in her research. The light was not simply haunting the space where Dinah had vanished. It was holding that space, keeping it open, refusing to let it be completely paved over and forgotten. Every year when the light appeared, it was restaking a claim, saying, "Here is where it happened. Here is where a woman walked into mystery. Here is where the rules of the world as you understand them broke down. Here is where something impossible occurred." The light was a kind of monument, more permanent than any stone marker, more visible than any historical plaque. It was Dinah's monument to herself, built from nothing but determination and whatever force had carried her beyond the gate that night in 1840. The question that haunted Jennifer, as it had haunted everyone who seriously contemplated the phenomenon, was what had happened to Dinah. Where had she gone when she walked into that hovering light? Had she found freedom, or had she found something else entirely, something that existed outside the binary of bondage and liberty? Dr. Cross had interviewed descendants of enslaved people from the plantation who passed down stories about Dinah, and some of those stories suggested that Dinah had not escaped to the north but had instead escaped from the world entirely, had found a door into some other kind of existence. They spoke of the old African traditions, of spirit worlds that existed alongside the physical world, of thresholds that could be crossed by those who knew how to see them. They suggested that Dinah had been searching for such a threshold every night she walked the garden paths and had finally found it. Jennifer did not know if she believed in spirit worlds or alternate dimensions or any explanation that required stepping outside the material reality she had always accepted as complete. But she could not deny what she had witnessed, and she could not deny that the light moved with intention, with purpose, with something that looked very much like consciousness, even if it had no physical form. She began to think that perhaps the question of what had happened to Dinah was less important than the fact that Dinah had made something happen, had acted rather than simply endured, had chosen movement even if the destination was unknown. In a life where almost every choice had been made for her, where her body and her labor and her very existence had been controlled by others, Dinah had made one choice entirely her own. She had walked toward the mysterious light, and whatever it had offered her, she had accepted. Years passed, and Jennifer grew older, and the world continued its rapid changes, but the light remained constant. It appeared every spring on the night of the full moon, traced its patient circuit through the neighborhood, paused by the corner where a gate had once stood, and faded as the moon descended. New houses were built and old houses torn down. Trees grew and died and were replaced. Children grew up and moved away and sometimes returned with children of their own. But the light persisted, outlasting individual lives and individual memories, becoming something larger than any single story. In her later years, Jennifer would sometimes bring her granddaughter to watch the light. The girl, named Maya, was 10 years old and filled with questions about everything. She asked Jennifer why the light appeared, where it came from, what it meant. Jennifer tried to explain about Dinah Foster, about slavery and freedom and the way history erases some people while elevating others. Maya listened with the seriousness of a child who understands that she is being told something important, even if she cannot fully grasp all the implications. When the light appeared, Maya gasped and grabbed Jennifer's hand, and they stood together watching the soft glow move through the darkness. "Is she sad?" Maya asked, watching the light pause by the corner. Jennifer thought about the question, about all the easy answers she could give, about the complexity of truth. "I think she's waiting," Jennifer finally said. "I think she's been waiting a very long time for something, and she's patient enough to wait as long as it takes." "Waiting for what?" "Maybe for someone to remember her," Jennifer said. "Maybe for the world to change enough that what happened to her could never happen again. Maybe for something I can't even imagine. I don't think anyone knows but her." Maya nodded, accepting this uncertainty with the flexibility of youth. They watched in silence as the light completed its pause and began to fade. Just before it vanished entirely, Maya whispered, "I see you," so quietly that Jennifer almost did not hear it. The light seemed to pulse once more, just for a moment, and then it was gone, leaving them standing in the ordinary darkness of a suburban street. That night, Jennifer dreamed of the garden as it must have looked in Dinah's time, with the herb garden carefully tended, the roses in full bloom, the paths swept clean. She dreamed she saw a tall, graceful woman walking with a lantern, moving through the darkness with purpose and grace. The woman's face was turned away, and Jennifer could never quite see it clearly. But she felt she knew the woman anyway. Knew her in the way you know someone whose story has become part of your own story, whose life has touched yours across an unbridgeable distance of time and circumstance. In the dream, the woman reached the back gate and set down her lantern. She stood looking out at something Jennifer could not see, something that existed beyond the gate, beyond the plantation, beyond the world that had tried to contain her. Then she stepped forward and light engulfed her, and she was gone, and the lantern remained behind, burning with impossible persistence. Jennifer woke with tears on her face and a feeling in her chest that was equal parts grief and joy, mourning and celebration. She understood then, as much as anyone could understand, that Dinah had found what she was looking for that night in 1840. She had found a way out, not just from the plantation, but from a world that could not conceive of her as fully human. She had walked into mystery and never returned, and the light was her way of saying, "I was here, I mattered, I chose." The light continues to appear every spring, as it has appeared every spring for nearly 200 years. It will likely continue to appear for years to come, perhaps for as long as anyone remembers to look for it, perhaps longer, because the light is not bound by the normal rules of memory or monument. It exists in a space between the physical and the spiritual, between history and myth, between what happened and what it means. It is Dinah's gift to the world, this annual reminder that there are always doors that the powerful cannot lock, paths that the cruel cannot block, lights that no darkness can extinguish. Those who see the light carry the memory with them, and in carrying it, they keep Dinah's story alive. They tell others, and those others tell still more, and the story spreads in the way that true stories always spread, changing slightly with each telling but maintaining its essential core. a woman walked into mystery. She never returned, but she left behind a light that burns once each year, patient and persistent, waiting for something that might never come but refusing to surrender the possibility that it could. In this refusal, in this patient burning, there is a kind of freedom that no chains could ever bind. There is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit, the part of us that insists on meaning even in meaningless circumstances, that insists on hope even in hopeless situations, that insists on light even in the deepest darkness. And so the light burns on year after year, spring after spring, moon after moon, carrying Dinah Foster forward through time in the only way available to those who have been erased from history. It burns for her, and for all those like her whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, whose lives were never acknowledged as lives at all. It burns as a promise and a warning, a reminder that every person matters, every story deserves to be told, every light deserves to be seen. It burns because Dinah walked into darkness carrying a lantern, and when she let go of that lantern, she lit a flame that history could not extinguish, that time could not diminish, that forgetfulness could not erase. The lantern burns still beside a gate that no longer exists, in a garden that has been paved over, in a world that has changed beyond recognition from the one Dinah knew. But the light remains constant, patient, waiting, always waiting. And perhaps in that waiting there is something more profound than any answer could provide, something that speaks to the deepest human questions about meaning and memory and the ways we testify to our existence. Perhaps the light will burn forever, or perhaps one spring it will finally fade and never return, its purpose fulfilled, its message delivered, its witness complete. But until that day, if it ever comes, the light will continue to trace its path through the darkness, moving with purpose through the changed landscape, holding space for a story that deserves to be remembered, for a woman who deserves to be mourned and celebrated, for a mystery that deserves to be honored rather than solved. The light burns on, and in its burning, Dinah Foster lives on, no longer enslaved, no longer erased, no longer invisible. She is the light in the darkness, the flame that will not go out, the woman who walked beyond the world and left behind a testament that time itself cannot destroy. She is Dinah of Savannah, slave woman who walked into the lantern light and never returned, and her story is not over yet. There are scholars now who study the phenomenon with instruments that would have seemed like magic to the people of 1840. They bring electromagnetic field detectors and thermal imaging cameras and spectrometers designed to measure wavelengths of light. The instruments register nothing unusual, just as they have always registered nothing unusual, because the light that appears each spring exists in a realm where measurement has no meaning. It cannot be quantified or categorized or reduced to data points on a graph. It simply is, and in that simple existence, it defies every attempt to explain it away, to rationalize it into something comfortable and comprehensible. Some of these scholars argue that the light is a collective hallucination, that the power of suggestion combined with cultural memory creates an experience that feels real but has no objective existence. Others counter that too many independent witnesses have reported identical details, that the consistency of the phenomenon across centuries suggests something more than imagination at work. The debates continue in academic journals and conference presentations, but they seem somehow beside the point. Because whether the light is objectively real or subjectively experienced, it has the same effect on those who witness it. It changes them. It opens something in their understanding of what is possible, what is knowable, what deserves to be honored in the space between certainty and mystery. Jennifer Hayes, now in her 70s, still walks out each spring to watch for the light. Her granddaughter Maya is grown now, living in Atlanta, working as a civil rights attorney, but she returns each year to stand beside her grandmother and bear witness. Maya has brought her own children to see the light, continuing a tradition that has become, in its own way, a kind of resistance against forgetting, a refusal to let the easy narratives of progress erase the difficult truths of history. They stand together, 3 generations, watching the light move through the darkness, and in that watching they participate in something larger than themselves, something that connects them backward to Dinah Foster and forward to generations not yet born, who will continue to ask what happened on that night in 1840. The neighborhood has changed again, as neighborhoods always do. Some of the houses Jennifer knew have been torn down and replaced with newer constructions. Young families move in, drawn by good schools and proximity to downtown Savannah. They hear rumors about the light from their neighbors, and some dismiss it as local superstition while others mark their calendars and wait with curiosity mixed with skepticism. But when the light appears, as it always does, even the skeptics find themselves moved by something they cannot fully articulate, touched by the persistence of this mysterious beacon that refuses to be extinguished by time or disbelief or the steady march of rational explanation. Among the new residents is a man named David Chen, a documentary filmmaker who moved to Savannah in 2022 with his wife and twin daughters. David first heard about the light from his neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. She told him the story over the fence one afternoon while he was planting azaleas in his front yard, and David listened with the polite attention of someone who assumes he is being told a charming local legend with no basis in fact. Mrs. Patterson seemed to sense his skepticism because she looked at him with an expression that was part amusement and part challenge, and she said simply, "Wait until April. You'll see." David did not think much about the conversation until the following spring when his daughter Emma came running into the house one evening, breathless with excitement, saying there was a ghost in the backyard. David followed her outside, expecting to find nothing more than shadows cast by the street lamps or perhaps a neighbor's flashlight. Instead, he saw the light moving through his yard with that characteristic purposeful quality that could not be mistaken for anything ordinary. He stood transfixed, watching it trace a path that seemed to follow some invisible route only it could see. His wife Rachel joined him, and together they watched the light complete its circuit, moving through their property and into the neighbor's yard, continuing on its way toward the corner where nothing remarkable stood except a fire hydrant and a stop sign. David's filmmaker instincts kicked in immediately. He wanted to document this, to capture it on film, to understand what he was seeing through the lens of his camera. The next day, he began researching the phenomenon, finding Dr. Cross's old article, reading newspaper accounts from different decades, discovering the story of Dinah Foster buried in historical archives. The more he learned, the more fascinated he became, not just with the light itself, but with what it represented. The way it had persisted across centuries, the way it had touched so many lives and changed so many people's understanding of what was possible. David decided to make a documentary about the light and about Dinah Foster. He reached out to historians and paranormal researchers, to descendants of enslaved people who had lived on the Hartwell plantation, to Jennifer Hayes, who had been watching the light for decades. He interviewed Maya, who spoke eloquently about how witnessing the light had influenced her decision to become a civil rights attorney, how it had given her a visceral understanding of the importance of bearing witness, of refusing to let stories be erased. He spoke with physicists who had tried to measure the light and spiritualists who believed it was a genuine manifestation of the spirit world. He collected accounts from hundreds of witnesses spanning multiple generations, and what emerged from all these conversations was a portrait not just of a paranormal phenomenon, but of a community shaped by mystery, bound together by the annual appearance of something that defied explanation. The documentary took David 3 years to complete. He filmed the light himself on multiple occasions, and like every filmmaker before him, he found that his cameras could not quite capture what the human eye perceived. The footage showed something, a faint glow that moved through the darkness, but it lacked the presence, the sense of consciousness and purpose that witnesses consistently described. David struggled with this limitation, trying different cameras, different settings, different techniques, but nothing worked. Finally, he accepted that the light was meant to be experienced rather than documented, that some truths could only be understood through direct encounter. The documentary premiered at a film festival in Charleston in 2025, and it received unexpected attention. Critics praised David's sensitive handling of the material, the way he balanced skepticism with respect, the way he allowed the mystery to remain mysterious while still exploring its implications. The film did not attempt to explain the light or prove its existence, but instead examined what it meant that so many people had seen it, what it revealed about the persistence of memory, about the ways trauma and hope can manifest across generations, about the human need to believe that the erased and forgotten can somehow testify to their existence even after death. After the documentary's release, interest in the light intensified. More people began coming to watch for it each spring, not just locals but visitors from across the country who had seen the film and wanted to witness the phenomenon for themselves. The quiet annual appearance that had once been observed by a handful of neighbors now drew crowds of 50 or more people, all standing in the darkness with their cameras and phones raised, waiting for the light to appear. Jennifer worried that this attention might somehow diminish the experience, might turn something sacred into a spectacle. But when the light appeared that first year after the documentary's release, it was exactly as it had always been, patient and purposeful and utterly indifferent to the size of its audience. Among the new witnesses was a woman named Cassandra Williams who had traveled from Detroit specifically to see the light. Cassandra was the great-great-great-granddaughter of a woman who had been enslaved on a plantation in Alabama, and she had spent years researching her family history, trying to piece together the stories that had been lost or deliberately destroyed. She had seen David's documentary and felt a connection to Dinah Foster's story, saw in it an echo of her own ancestors' life, about which almost nothing was known beyond a name and a few dates in a slave registry. Cassandra stood in the crowd that April night, and when the light appeared, she felt something break open inside her chest, all the accumulated grief of generations suddenly made visible and real. The light moved through the crowd, and people parted to let it pass, creating a corridor of space through which it could travel. Cassandra found herself stepping forward, following the light at a respectful distance, drawn by something she could not name. Other descendants of enslaved people joined her, forming a small procession behind the light as it traced its path. They walked in silence, this impromptu gathering of people connected by history and blood and the shared experience of carrying stories that had been deemed unworthy of remembering. When the light paused at its usual spot, they formed a circle around it, and someone began to hum a spiritual, one of the old songs that had been passed down through generations, and others joined in, their voices rising in the darkness, creating a harmony that felt like prayer and proclamation combined. The light seemed to pulse in response to the singing, growing slightly brighter, and Cassandra felt tears streaming down her face. She was not crying from sadness exactly, though there was sadness in it. She was crying from recognition, from the feeling of being seen across time, from the understanding that her ancestors' life, like Dinah's life, had mattered, even though history had tried to erase it. The singing continued for the full 12 minutes that the light paused, and when it finally began to fade, the voices gradually quieted, until there was only silence and darkness and the sound of people breathing together in the spring night. That gathering became a tradition. Each year after, descendants of enslaved people would come to witness the light and to sing the old spirituals, to bear witness not just to Dinah's story, but to all the stories that had been lost, all the lives that had been lived in bondage and dignity combined. The gathering grew, became organized, with local churches and historical societies helping to coordinate the event. Someone suggested creating a memorial garden on the site, and after years of fundraising and planning, a small park was established where the back gate had once stood. The park featured a bronze plaque with Dinah Foster's name and the dates of her birth and disappearance, along with a simple inscription that read, "In memory of all who were enslaved on this land, your stories matter, your lives matter, you are not forgotten." The memorial sparked conversations throughout Savannah about other sites where enslaved people had lived and worked, about the need to mark these places, to tell these stories, to refuse the comfortable narratives that wanted to remember the beautiful houses and elegant gardens while forgetting the people whose labor had made them possible. Historical markers began appearing throughout the city, small bronze plaques that noted where slave auctions had been held, where enslaved people had lived, where they had resisted and survived and sometimes succeeded in escaping. It was not enough, could never be enough to balance the scales of historical injustice. But it was something, a beginning, an acknowledgement that the past was not as simple or as graceful as the tourist brochures suggested. David Chen's documentary continued to reach new audiences, shown in schools and universities, discussed in classes about history and film and the nature of truth. Students would watch the footage of the light and debate what it represented, whether it was a genuine paranormal phenomenon or a collective expression of cultural memory or something else entirely. Some professors used the film to talk about the limits of empirical evidence, about the kinds of knowledge that cannot be captured by scientific instruments, about the importance of testimony and witness even when that testimony describes experiences that cannot be verified. Others used it to discuss the ongoing impact of slavery, the ways trauma and resistance echo across generations, the persistence of stories that refuse to be silenced. Jennifer Hayes watched all of this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She was glad that Dinah's story was being told, that more people were learning about what had happened on this land, that the light was inspiring conversations about memory and justice and the importance of bearing witness. But she also worried that something essential was being lost in all the attention, that the mystery was being domesticated, turned into something safe and comprehensible when it should remain unsettling, challenging, impossible to fully grasp. She spoke about these concerns to Maya, who understood but gently suggested that perhaps the light was strong enough to resist domestication, that it had survived 2 centuries of attempts to explain it away, and would likely survive this new wave of attention as well. Maya was right. Despite all the cameras and crowds and academic analysis, the light remained fundamentally mysterious. It appeared when it chose to appear, followed its path with its characteristic patience, and faded when the moon touched the horizon, completely indifferent to what anyone thought or said about it. The experience of witnessing it remained powerful and transformative, even for those who came expecting nothing more than an interesting visual phenomenon. Something about the light cut through cynicism and skepticism, touched something deep in the human psyche that recognized it as significant, even if significance could not be rationally justified. In 2028, a group of quantum physicists from Georgia Tech became interested in the phenomenon, theorizing that it might represent some kind of temporal anomaly, a place where the normal flow of time had been disrupted. They received permission to set up monitoring equipment around the site, sensors that would record any unusual fluctuations in the local space-time continuum during the light's appearance. They worked for months preparing running tests, calibrating their instruments with meticulous precision. When the night finally came, they were ready, their equipment humming and recording, their eyes fixed on monitors that would show any deviation from normal physical laws. The light appeared exactly on schedule, and the physicists watched their instruments with intense focus. Several sensors registered brief anomalies, fluctuations that could not be easily explained by background radiation or electromagnetic interference. But the anomalies were subtle, barely above the noise threshold, and when the physicists analyzed their data in the weeks that followed, they could not definitively conclude that anything unusual had occurred. The lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, admitted in her final report that the light remained unexplained by current physical models. But she resisted the temptation to speculate wildly about what that might mean. Science, she noted, was comfortable with mysteries. The fact that something could not yet be explained did not mean it was supernatural, only that human understanding remained incomplete. Dr. Kim's report satisfied no one. Believers in the paranormal claimed she was refusing to acknowledge obvious evidence of spiritual phenomena. Skeptics argued that the lack of clear results proved the light was nothing more than misperception and suggestion. Dr. Kim herself became fascinated by the phenomenon in a way that transcended her scientific training. She returned the following year not as a researcher but as a simple witness, and when the light appeared, she found herself moved in ways her instruments could never measure. She wrote a personal essay about the experience, published in a literary magazine rather than a scientific journal, describing how the light had made her question the boundaries she had always maintained between the measurable and the meaningful, between what could be proven and what could be known. The essay reached readers who had never heard of Dinah Foster or the mysterious light, and it inspired some of them to make their own pilgrimages to Savannah. Among these new pilgrims was an artist named James Morrison, a painter known for his large abstract canvases that explored themes of memory and loss. James had lost his brother to police violence 3 years earlier, and he had been struggling to process his grief, to find a way to transform the rage and sorrow into something that honored his brother's memory without being consumed by it. He read Dr. Kim's essay on a sleepless night, and something in her description of the light, the way she talked about persistence and patience and the refusal to be extinguished, resonated with his own struggles. James arrived in Savannah 2 weeks before the light was scheduled to appear. Wanting time to absorb the place, to understand its history, to prepare himself for whatever he might experience, he walked the neighborhood where the light appeared, talked to residents, visited the memorial garden that had been created in Dinah's honor. He read everything he could find about her, about the plantation, about the system of slavery that had consumed so many lives. He visited the Historical Society archives and spent hours looking at old photographs and documents, trying to imagine what the world had looked like through Dinah's eyes, what she had thought and felt and hoped for during those years of enforced servitude. The night the light was scheduled to appear, James arrived early with his sketchbook and charcoal pencils. He had no plan to capture the light directly, knowing from David Chen's documentary that it resisted visual documentation, but he wanted to draw the people who came to witness it, to capture their faces as they watched, to document the human response to mystery. The crowd gathered as darkness fell, a mix of locals and visitors, descendants and researchers, believers and skeptics, all united by curiosity about what they would see. James moved through the crowd, sketching quickly, catching expressions of anticipation and wonder, doubt and determination. When the light appeared, James forgot about his sketchbook entirely. He stood frozen, his charcoal pencil falling from his fingers to the ground. His eyes locked on the soft glow that moved through the darkness with such deliberate grace. He felt his brother's presence, suddenly, powerfully, as if the light had somehow opened a channel between the living and the dead, between past and present, between memory and hope. He began to cry, quietly at first, and then with great shaking sobs that he could not control, and the people around him respectfully gave him space, understanding without needing explanation that he was experiencing something profound and private despite the public setting. The light passed close to where James stood, and for just a moment he thought he saw not just Dinah Foster but his brother, walking beside her, both of them moving towards something James could not see but could somehow feel, a destination that existed beyond the boundaries of the world he knew. The vision lasted only seconds, if it was a vision at all, and not simply his grief manifesting in a form his mind could comprehend, but it changed something fundamental in James. He understood suddenly that his brother was not gone, not in any ultimate sense, that love and memory were forces as real as gravity, that they persisted across time and death and all the boundaries that seemed so absolute but were perhaps more porous than he had imagined. In the months that followed, James created a series of paintings inspired by the light and by Dinah's story. The paintings were unlike his previous work, more figurative, more narrative, depicting shadowy forms moving through luminous spaces, reaching toward lights that burned in impossible places. The series was titled Walking into the Lantern Light, and when it was exhibited in New York, it received extraordinary attention. Critics praised the emotional power of the work, the way it balanced abstraction with recognizable human elements, the way it evoked feelings of loss and transcendence without resolving them into easy comfort. The paintings sold for substantial sums, and James donated half the proceeds to organizations working to end mass incarceration and police violence, feeling that this was what Dinah would have wanted, that her story should inspire action as well as reflection. The paintings brought even more attention to Dinah Foster and the mysterious light, and with that attention came inevitable commercialization. Tour companies added the light to their ghost tour itineraries, charging premium prices for the annual spring viewing. Someone created a smartphone app that counted down to the next appearance and provided historical information about Dinah and the plantation. Entrepreneurs sold T-shirts and postcards featuring artistic renditions of the light. Jennifer Hayes found all of this deeply disturbing, feeling that the mystery was being reduced to a commodity, that something sacred was being profaned for profit. She wrote letters to the city council, to the historical society, to anyone who might have authority to regulate the commercialization. But she was told repeatedly that there was little that could be done. The light appeared on public property, and people had a right to gather and watch it, and businesses had a right to sell products related to local history and folklore. Maya counseled her grandmother to focus on what mattered, which was not the commercialization but the continuing power of the light itself, the way it still transformed people who witnessed it despite all the noise and distraction surrounding it. She pointed out that Dinah's story was being told to audiences who would never have heard it otherwise, that children were learning about slavery and resistance in ways that made the history personal and immediate rather than abstract and distant. She reminded Jennifer that commercialization was not the same as erasure, that being remembered imperfectly was still better than being forgotten entirely. Jennifer heard the wisdom in her granddaughter's words, but she still felt a pang of loss for the quieter years when the light had been a secret shared among neighbors rather than a spectacle advertised to tourists. Despite her reservations, Jennifer continued her annual vigil, and she found that she could usually find a quiet spot away from the main crowds where she could watch the light in something approaching the solitude she remembered from earlier years. She would arrive an hour before the scheduled appearance, claiming her space, settling in with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for things worth waiting for. And when the light appeared, cutting through all the chatter and commercialization with its pure, patient presence, Jennifer would feel the same awe she had felt the first time she saw it, the same sense of being in the presence of something that transcended ordinary understanding. On the spring night of 2030, Jennifer was 82 years old, her body increasingly frail, but her mind still sharp and clear. Maya had offered to stay with her during the vigil, worried about her grandmother standing outside for hours in the cool night air. But Jennifer had insisted she was fine, that she needed to do this alone as she had done it for so many years. She stood in her usual spot, wrapped in a wool coat, leaning on a cane that she had recently conceded was necessary, watching the crowd gather and disperse into small groups, waiting for the moon to reach its zenith. The light appeared as it always did, and Jennifer watched it begin its circuit with a feeling that was part joy and part sorrow. She wondered how many more times she would witness this miracle, how many more springs she had left to stand in the darkness and watch the light trace its patient path. She thought about Dinah Foster, imagined her walking these same paths 2 centuries ago, carrying her own lantern, searching for something she could not name. Jennifer felt a kinship with that long-dead woman, felt that in some essential way they were both engaged in the same project, both refusing to let the darkness have the final word, both insisting through their persistence that hope and memory were forces strong enough to bend reality. The light moved closer, and Jennifer felt a sudden, powerful urge to follow it, to walk beside it as it completed its circuit, to accompany it to the spot where the back gate had once stood. Her rational mind warned her that this was foolish, that she was too old and unsteady to be walking in the darkness, that she should stay where she was and watch from a safe distance. But something deeper than rational thought was pulling her forward, and Jennifer found herself moving slowly and carefully, following the light as it wound through the neighborhood. Other people noticed and stepped aside, creating a path for her, recognizing something in her determination that demanded respect. Jennifer walked slowly, her cane tapping against the pavement, her eyes fixed on the light that moved just ahead of her, always just out of reach but never disappearing, as if it was deliberately pacing itself to match her slower gait. She could hear her heart beating in her chest, feel her breath coming shorter, but she kept moving, drawn by something she could not resist and did not want to resist. When the light reached the memorial garden, it paused, as it always did, and Jennifer stood beside it, closer than she had ever been before. She could see now that the light had a texture to it, a quality that was neither solid nor entirely incorporeal, something that existed between states of being. She reached out her hand, not quite touching but holding it near the light, feeling a warmth radiating from it that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with presence, with consciousness, with recognition. The light pulsed gently, and Jennifer felt tears streaming down her face, felt something in her chest that was too large for her body to contain, felt connected to every person who had ever witnessed this phenomenon, to Dinah Foster herself, to the long chain of human beings who had refused to let the darkness win. "I see you," Jennifer whispered, echoing the words her granddaughter had spoken years before. "I've always seen you. Thank you for letting me witness." The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and Jennifer felt a sensation like being embraced, like being held by invisible arms that were infinitely gentle and infinitely strong. She stood in that embrace for the full 12 minutes that the light remained, feeling more at peace than she had felt in her entire life, feeling that her years of bearing witness had been acknowledged and honored, feeling that she was part of something larger than her individual existence. When the light began to fade, Jennifer felt it like a physical loss, but also like a completion, a circle closing, a promise kept. She watched it dim and disappear, and when it was gone entirely, she found herself surrounded by people, some of them strangers, who had witnessed her walk and had been moved by it in ways they could not articulate. Maya appeared at Jennifer's side, having pushed through the crowd when she realized what her grandmother was doing, her face showing both concern and understanding. "Are you all right?" she asked, taking Jennifer's arm to steady her. "I'm perfect," Jennifer said, and she meant it. "I'm absolutely perfect." Jennifer Hayes died 3 months later, peacefully in her sleep. And at her funeral, Maya spoke about her grandmother's decades-long commitment to bearing witness, to keeping Dinah Foster's story alive, to refusing to let mystery be reduced to explanation. She told the assembled mourners about Jennifer's final walk with the light, about the expression of transcendent peace on her face, about how she had lived her life with integrity and purpose, and had died knowing that she had done something that mattered. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had been touched by Jennifer's willingness to talk about the light, to share the story, to help others understand what it meant to witness something that defied understanding. After Jennifer's death, Maya became the keeper of her grandmother's journals, notebooks filled with observations about the light, sketches of its path, notes about the people who had witnessed it over the years. Reading through these journals, Maya found entries that went back decades, careful documentation of each appearance, descriptions of how the light moved and when it appeared and how long it remained. Jennifer had kept records with the dedication of a scientist, but she had written with the heart of a poet, capturing not just what she saw but what she felt, how the experience changed her, what it taught her about persistence and memory and hope. Maya decided to publish selections from the journals, working with a small press that specialized in memoirs and personal histories. The book was titled Bearing Witness: A Lifetime with the Light of Dinah Foster, and it became an unexpected success, praised for its lyrical prose and its honest exploration of what it meant to spend years observing something that could not be fully explained. Readers wrote to Maya describing how the book had changed them, how it had made them think differently about the persistence of memory, about the importance of honoring stories that history tried to erase, about the courage required to stand in mystery rather than rushing to resolve it. The book brought new waves of visitors to Savannah, people who wanted to walk where Jennifer had walked, to stand where she had stood, to experience for themselves what she had spent decades documenting. Maya found herself giving talks about her grandmother's work, about Dinah Foster, about the ongoing importance of remembering and witnessing. She spoke at universities and historical societies, at churches and community centers, always emphasizing that the light was not just a curiosity or a spectacle, but a testament to human resilience, to the refusal to be erased, to the power of persistence across impossible odds. In 2035, Maya organized the first official Dinah Foster Memorial Ceremony, held each year on the anniversary of Dinah's disappearance. The ceremony included readings from Jennifer's journals, performances of spirituals by local choirs, speeches by historians and activists about the ongoing impact of slavery and the importance of truth-telling. The event drew larger crowds each year, becoming a focal point for conversations about racial justice, about historical memory, about the ways communities could honor difficult pasts while working toward better futures. The ceremony always concluded with a silent vigil, all attendees standing quietly as the sun set, holding candles that they would light from a central flame, creating a field of lights that echoed the mysterious glow that would appear later that same night. The light itself remained constant through all these changes, appearing each spring with its characteristic patience, tracing its path through the increasingly developed landscape, pausing at the memorial garden before fading with the descending moon. New witnesses continued to report the same sensations that had been described for nearly 2 centuries. The feeling of presence and purpose, the sense of being in contact with something that transcended ordinary reality, the profound emotional impact that often lasted long after the light disappeared. The phenomenon showed no signs of diminishing or changing, as if it existed outside the normal processes of decay and entropy that governed everything else in the physical world. Scientists continued to study it, though with increasingly sophisticated humility about the limits of scientific inquiry. A new generation of researchers approached the light not as a problem to be solved, but as a phenomenon to be respectfully observed, documented without the assumption that documentation would lead to complete understanding. They published papers acknowledging that human knowledge remained incomplete, that there were experiences that resisted reduction to data. That mystery was not a gap to be filled, but a reality to be accepted. Some of these researchers became advocates for expanding the definition of what counted as valid knowledge, arguing that testimony and lived experience deserved equal status with quantitative measurement in humanity's collective understanding of reality. The light also inspired artistic responses beyond James Morrison's paintings. Musicians composed pieces attempting to capture the quality of the music witnesses reported hearing, though they uniformly admitted that their compositions were approximations at best, translations of something that existed beyond conventional musical notation. Poets wrote verses exploring themes of absence and presence, of memory and forgetting, of the ways trauma and hope could coexist in the same space. Dancers choreographed pieces that traced the light's path through stylized movement, trying to embody its quality of patient, purposeful progression toward an unseen destination. Each artistic response added new layers to the cultural meaning of the light, new ways of thinking about what Dinah Foster's mysterious disappearance represented. In the academic world, Dinah's story became a case study in multiple disciplines. Historians used it to discuss the challenges of recovering stories from the enslaved population, the ways that absence of documentation did not mean absence of significance. Anthropologists examined how communities create and maintain collective memory around extraordinary events, how folklore and history interact and influence each other. Philosophers debated what the persistent reports of the light suggested about the nature of reality, whether consciousness could somehow imprint itself on physical space, whether the boundary between mind and matter was more permeable than materialist philosophy typically acknowledged. The discussions were rigorous and thoughtful, characterized by genuine intellectual humility and openness to possibilities that could not be easily categorized. Maya's own children, twins named Grace and Daniel, grew up with the light as a regular part of their lives. They attended the annual ceremony from earliest childhood, heard stories about their great-great-grandmother Jennifer and the enslaved woman Dinah Foster, whose mysterious disappearance had become central to their family's identity. As they grew older, they developed their own relationships with the phenomenon. Grace became fascinated by the historical dimensions, spending hours in archives researching slavery in Georgia, tracing networks of resistance and survival, trying to understand the world that Dinah had inhabited. Daniel was drawn to the spiritual dimensions, studying various religious and philosophical traditions that made space for mystery and transcendence, looking for frameworks that could help him understand what the light represented. When Grace and Daniel turned 16 in 2045, Maya took them to a private viewing of the light, arriving hours before the crowds would gather, claiming a quiet spot in the memorial garden where they could experience it together as a family. She told them about Jennifer's final walk with the light, about how their great-great-grandmother had devoted decades to bearing witness, about the journals that had become the basis for Maya's book. She talked about Dinah Foster, about the sparse facts that were known and the vast unknowns that surrounded her life, about how the light was, in some sense, Dinah's autobiography, the only testimony she had been able to leave about her existence and her refusal to accept the limits imposed on her. When the light appeared, Grace and Daniel watched with the kind of focused attention that teenagers rarely gave to anything, their usual ironic detachment completely absent. They saw their mother's face transformed by wonder, saw tears streaming down her cheeks, and they understood that they were part of something much larger than their individual lives, that they carried a responsibility to continue the work of witnessing and remembering. The light moved through the garden, and Grace found herself thinking about all the other enslaved people who had lived and died on this land, whose names had not been recorded, whose stories had been completely erased. She felt a fierce determination to spend her life recovering those stories, to be a voice for the voiceless, to ensure that what happened in the past was never sanitized or forgotten. Daniel watched the light with a different kind of attention, trying to open himself to whatever it might communicate, trying to still his mind enough to perceive beyond the surface of things. He felt something he could only describe as a presence, a consciousness that was both utterly foreign and strangely familiar, something that existed on a different plane from ordinary awareness but could occasionally touch and be touched by human minds prepared to receive it. He understood in that moment why his great-great-grandmother had devoted so many years to this practice, why simply standing and watching mattered, why bearing witness was itself a form of resistance and remembrance and love. The light paused at its appointed spot, and Maya gathered her children close, the three of them standing together in the darkness, connected to each other and to all the other witnesses across time who had stood in similar darkness watching the same mysterious phenomenon. Maya thought about her grandmother, about how Jennifer would have loved to see this moment, to know that the work of remembering would continue through another generation. She felt Jennifer's presence not in any supernatural sense, but in the way that loved ones persist through the values they instilled and the examples they set, through the ripples they created that continue spreading long after their physical presence has ended. When the light faded that night, Grace and Daniel were both crying. Not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming recognition, from understanding that they had witnessed something profound and been changed by it. They walked back to the car in silence, each processing the experience in their own way, knowing without needing to discuss it that this night would mark a turning point in their lives, that they would forever divide their existence into before and after they truly understood what the light represented. Years continued to pass, and the light continued to appear, and the cycle of witness and remembrance continued. Technology advanced in ways that would have seemed like magic to Dinah Foster's contemporaries, but the light remained untouched by technological progress, existing in the same form it had always taken, moving along the same path, pausing at the same spot. The world changed in countless ways. Social movements rose and fell, governments came and went, but the light persisted, patient and constant, a fixed point in a swirling chaos of change. In the 220th year after Dinah's disappearance, the city of Savannah held a special commemoration, recognizing the light as an official historical phenomenon and designating the memorial garden as a protected site. The ceremony was attended by thousands of people, including descendants of the Hartwell family who came to acknowledge their ancestors' role in the system of slavery and to commit themselves to ongoing work of repair and reconciliation. Representatives from historical societies and civil rights organizations spoke about the importance of truth-telling, about facing historical trauma honestly rather than hiding behind comfortable myths, about the ongoing work of creating a society that genuinely valued all human lives. The keynote speaker was Grace Chen, now a renowned historian whose work on slavery and resistance had transformed academic understanding of the period. She stood before the crowd and talked about her great-great-grandmother Jennifer, about Dinah Foster, about all the unnamed and unremembered people whose lives had been consumed by slavery. She talked about the light as a form of testimony that could not be silenced or erased, as proof that even when systems of power tried to reduce human beings to property, to strip them of their agency and their stories, something essential persisted, something that could not be contained or controlled or destroyed. Dinah Foster walked into mystery, Grace said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. We don't know where she went or what she found, We don't know if the light is her spirit or her memory or some other manifestation that we lack the language to describe. What we know is that she refused to accept the limits imposed on her, that she walked toward freedom even when freedom seemed impossible, that she left behind a testament that has endured for more than 2 centuries. The light is not just about Dinah. It's about everyone who has ever resisted oppression, everyone who has ever insisted on their own humanity in the face of systems designed to deny it, everyone who has ever chosen hope over despair, action over resignation, persistence over surrender. The crowd erupted in applause, and Grace felt tears on her face, felt connected to everyone present, to everyone who had ever stood in this place watching the light, to her great-great-grandmother and to Dinah Foster and to all the witnesses across time who had refused to let the darkness have the final word. That night when the light appeared, it seemed somehow brighter than usual, as if it was acknowledging the recognition, accepting the testimony of those who had gathered to honor it. The light traced its path through the memorial garden, through the crowds of witnesses who stood in respectful silence. And when it paused at its appointed spot, thousands of voices rose together singing the old spirituals, singing songs of sorrow and hope, singing testaments to survival and resistance and the refusal to be forgotten. The light remained for its 12 minutes, pulsing gently in time with the singing. And then it faded as it always did, leaving behind only darkness and memory and the certain knowledge that it would return again when the spring came, when the moon rose full over Savannah, when another generation of witnesses gathered to stand in mystery and be transformed by it. The light would continue, would persist across decades and centuries, would burn on as long as anyone remained to witness it, as long as anyone remembered to look for it. As long as anyone believed that the erased and forgotten could still testify to their existence, that no darkness was absolute, that every light, no matter how small or mysterious, mattered in the endless night.